Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. I'm Gene Delasala with Audioholics, and we have Matthew Pose and Teo Nikolakis with us, and we are doing a live stream tonight, 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time on our YouTube channel. How are you guys doing, my friends?
Gene, doing great. How are you? How are you feeling?
I'm hanging in there, man. I'm getting over this bad bronchitis that I inherited from New Orleans at our Sound United event. So it's the gift that keeps on giving, apparently, for the whole month.
Yeah, Gene, I'm sorry to hear you're not feeling well, but it's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm glad both of you guys are here, actually. I think this is a great avenue now. We've got a three-way conversation going. I like the fact that we're going to have Teo, you're going to kind of be the guy that moderates and asks questions. And then Matt and I will kind of just tackle those questions and try to get as much down as we can here. The topic, of course, is inflated power ratings in AV receivers. As you guys know, I just basically dropped an anvil on the industry. I wrote an article about how ridiculous the inflated power is, particularly in Atmos receivers, I've noticed over the last few years. Also in home theater in a box situations that, Teo, you found when you were going to Best Buy recently. And we want to do something about it. Rather than just talking about it and crying and whining about it, we're actually creating a movement now. It's called the TIP movement, Truth in Power. So, Teo, I want you to kind of introduce some of the stuff that you found when you went to Best Buy over the last couple of days, because I had you go on a scout mission. You were my little scout. You went out and you wanted to see what was kind of labeled on these products.
So I had a lot of fun going to Best Buy. First of all, full disclosure, love Best Buy, right? And went over to the AVR section. And what I found extremely interesting is the fact that one of the main selling points for all the AVRs is a big fat sticker that gives you a bogus power rating. So it seems as though what you have in the big box stores is whatever they can try to disclose for power ratings. And Gene, I want you to talk a little bit about what those numbers mean, is how they assume the consumer is going to make a decision on which AVR to buy.
Yeah. So, all right. So let me give you guys a little history. If you look at the article, I'll link it up in the thread below in case anyone hasn't seen it. Back in around 1974, I believe, the FTC had to come in and step in on all these bogus power claims that were coming out with amplifiers. Like they did PMPO, which is like some type of peak power measurement, basically calculating nonsense about how powerful these products were. So the government had to actually step in and mandate that power had to be rated with both channels driven, because back then it was only stereo, full bandwidth, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. That's what our ears hear, and undistorted or unclipped. So, and that's been going fine for over the years. Most of the time when you looked at AV receivers or amplifiers, it always said, 100 watts a channel per FTC. And then if you looked at the fine print, it would tell you the bandwidth, the impedance at 8 ohms, for example. Obviously, a speaker is not an 8 ohm resistor, but you have to have a reference when you're claiming power. So you would either reference power in 8 ohms or 4 ohms. Well, everything was great up until, I believe, up until Atmos came out and manufacturers started stuffing more channels in the same size chassis. And instead of derating the power of those amplifiers, they were actually saying that these amplifiers were more powerful. And they didn't weigh more. They didn't have a bigger power supply. There was no physics or no breaking the laws of physics to get more power into these products and more channel density. So what they were doing was, rather than rating 2 channels driven, they were rating 1 channel driven. And they were being even more meticulous or more scrupulous about it. They were rating it at 6 ohms instead of 8 ohms, which gives the illusion of more power now, because now you're rating it into a lower impedance. And they were rating it at clipping, at 10% distortion instead of 1% or 0.1%. Just so you guys understand, clipping is when the waveform that's normally sinusoidal, when you do test tones, now becomes a square wave. And it's basically sending DC into a speaker. It sounds nasty. It's actually not good for a tweeter, especially if you send a DC signal into a tweeter. You could fry it if you send a long enough duty cycle into that tweeter. So they were doing this basically to double the power ratings of what the receiver should be. So for example, when you went to Best Buy, Teo, you saw like an Onkyo receiver that was rated at, I think it was 155 watts a channel.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality,
and then if you looked at the fine print, what did you really see that it was rated at?
Like 80 watts a channel, right? So
Exactly.
they're fudging it now. They're making people think that they're getting double the power of what they're actually buying. But even more than that, some of these, not even the manufacturers. So I guess some of the manufacturers are like, I saw it on the Sony website, but also at the Best Buy displays. They're taking that one channel max bogus number and they're multiplying it by the number of channels to kind of tell you that you're getting that much power across 7 channels. And of course, that's not true.
So what did we see? We saw that basically an 80 watt per channel AVR was being rated for 1100 watts.
Exactly. It's crazy. It's crazy. And the home theater in a boxes are even worse because now you're seeing a $500 home theater in a box that's advertising 1,000 watts with all the speakers and the subwoofer, and it's just nonsense. They're throwing in maybe a 40 or 50 watt per channel receiver into this thing, and they're just inflating the power numbers.
So, Gene, Matt, this is obviously from our point of view, we get it, and it's actually pretty funny. So we enjoy the comedy of seeing these sorts of power ratings, but let's try to explain to everybody who's listening, why does power even matter? Why is it important for a manufacturer to give us honest AVR power readings?
Matt, why don't you take this one, because I've been preaching enough about this. I'd like to hear your take.
Sure, thanks. So, power matters because it's what dictates essentially how loud your speakers are able to play. And how loud the speaker is able to play is critical for understanding the dynamic range capabilities of your system. So whether you're watching movies or music, that maximum power output is necessary to reach the dynamic peaks. One of the things that I actually preach, I think in some ways more extreme than you do on this, is that if you're really trying to reproduce accurately the real life dynamics of music, whether it's what's encoded on the disc or when I say real life, the reality is even 100 watt per channel, 150 watt per channel receivers are almost always not enough. You actually need quite a bit more power than that. And most speakers are themselves not capable of A, handling enough power to do that, and B, playing loud enough in order to achieve that. So why does it matter how much power these things are rated at, or actually producing, I should say? Because it dictates the upper limits of how loud the system can play. And one of the things that can most critically hurt the sound of a system is distortion. So if you're sitting here and you're listening to your system at the level that you find comfortable, that you want to listen at, and it hits a dynamic peak, and suddenly you start hearing audible clipping in the amplifier, and it is very audible, that's going to take you out of the moment very quickly. So we want these, realistically, we want our receivers to be as powerful as they can be reasonably. And we don't want to be hitting clipping like that.
So let's say that I'm an average consumer. I go to Best Buy and I'm buying an entry-level AVR, which typically these are. You're seeing AVRs that are in the price point probably up to $700-800, unless you're in one of the Magnolia stores. So am I really going to notice a difference as a consumer if I don't play the system all that loud?
Well, I mean, in most cases, when you're buying an entry-level receiver, I'm putting my consumer hat on for someone that's going in that doesn't want to spend a lot of money. Because most of the time, when people go into these department stores, they want to put all their budget towards the display, right? They'll spend $2,000 on a 56 or 55-inch OLED display, but then they want all the speakers and the receiver for $400. So most people's priority is not sound. Most people they're all visual people, right? So in those cases, when you're buying a small receiver with little speakers, they're probably not going to notice if that receiver is only putting out 30 or 40 watts a channel, as opposed to getting like a really high quality, high power amp, high sensitivity, loud output system, because quite frankly, they're not that into it. Okay. So they're probably not cranking it. They're not maybe driving it to its limits, even though you or I can come in there and say, man, this thing is really compressed, or it's lacking bandwidth, or it doesn't sound good. As long as it sounds better than their TV, I think most people are happy. But the problem I see with that is when you start lying about the power of these systems and you start saying you could fill a giant room with a system that's really can't do it, just kind of like the cube systems. You hear those systems in a near-field environment, they sound okay. You put a Bose cube system in a big room and it just gets drowned out, right? The thing is, unless people understand the difference, and if you don't show them the difference demonstratively, but then you just basically say that this receiver could put out 1200 watts. Why buy a 5-channel parasound that could put out 1200 watts at 5 channels when there's no difference on paper because the specs are being, basically being manipulated? I think it does a disservice to the industry, and that's a big pet peeve of mine. I don't like bullshit in advertising. That's why I started Audioholics 20 years ago with the slogan "Pursuing the Truth in Audio." Regardless of whether or not the average person that's playing movies at low levels and just using it for background music, whether or not his receiver is truly delivering 50 watts a channel or speccing it at some bogus 1200 watts and he may not notice. Yeah, it's true. He may not notice the difference because he's not driving it to those levels. But we notice the difference because we like truth and speckmanship, and we like to strive for better things. And I think as an industry, we should be all striving for better things because we're losing the art form, in my opinion. I think people are getting too much into, mobile devices and streaming and too much of the convenience. They're not focusing on the audio quality. It's kind of that's becoming a secondary concern. So now if people are thinking they're getting all this great performance for $400, I think it's doing a disservice in the industry, in my opinion.
You make a great point. And Gene, my observation is we always tend to go for convenience first, right? If something new comes out, we look at the convenience aspect, and then quality seems to follow later. And I think that was, let's go back to last week's video that we did. And when we were down in New Orleans, when we were with the folks from Sound United, that seemed to be a major theme as well. And if you remember when we were in that amazing Atmos demo that was with the definitive technology and with the Marantz setup, they opened that setup with Cloverfield. Do you remember that opening scene? And there's no spoken word at all for the first couple of minutes. And yet it's the music that carries and it brings you into the movie, and it creates this incredible emotional attachment that you have with this character and the events that are happening. And it's the music that is able to do that. And to be able to listen to that on a system that can truly deliver that emotional impact does something. I still remember being in the room with you and with all the other reviewers, and that was something powerful. So speaking of power, why don't you tell us then, what is truth in power, since you mentioned about Audioholics and about this movement?
Well, I think at the very minimum, truth in power is at least to adhere to the 2-channel driven full bandwidth FTC rating. I think that's we have to set bare minimum specs in this industry. I don't think it's realistic to say we need to know what the power is with all channels driven once you get past 5 or 7 channels, because then you start exceeding the power capability of your wall outlet. The average wall outlet is 120 volts, 15 amps. That's 1800 watts. So when you take 1800 watts and you divide that by the max efficiency of a Class AB amplifier, fully loaded, is maybe 70%, right? So you take 1800 times 0.7, you got 1260 watts, divide that by 7, you have the max capability of about 180 watts a channel, all channels driven. And that's really stretching it. That's assuming there's no other losses in the amplifier itself or processors or all that. You start putting 15 channels on that thing, and that power level is going to drop to maybe 70 or 80 watts. So you got to be realistic. You can't expect an all-in-one box that does everything, that does your HDMI switching, it does your audio and video processing. You can't expect it to give you the 150 watt rating for all channels driven. So you got to have a bare minimum. I would say at the very minimum, you need to have those front 2 channels full bandwidth rated. And then you should have another rating, which I think is important, is to have the front 3 channels, the LCRs, which I believe most of the power in a home theater goes to the LCRs. That's where most of the action is, that anchors the movie. So drive those 3 front channels full power, and then drive all the remaining channels at 1/8 that rated power. And that power level for those 3 channels driven should be at least 70% of the 2-channel rating, because that'll tell you if the power supply inside the unit is capable enough, and if the unit itself has enough heatsink area and enough cooling to keep that unit going, to keep the ratings up for sustained power levels with at least those front 3 channels at full power. I think if we start getting some truth there, then you'll start separating the men from the mouse. You'll start seeing some of these cheaper receivers that claim they're 1200 watts by summing up all the power. They're not going to deliver anywhere near that power with 1 or 2 or 3 channels driven. And then you'll start seeing a reason for why you need to step up to the better products, or even step up and get a preamp, or get a receiver that has preamp outputs to use external amplification, at least for the front 3 channels. Now, we're not talking about massive amounts of differences in loudness when you go from 100 watts to 200 watts. You're talking about maybe 3 dB of output. But it's not just the loudness, it's also the quality of that loudness and how that amplifier can drive those speakers. Because I've seen a lot of receivers that just fall apart when they try to drive a 4-ohm load. Most receivers can't drive a 4-ohm load. Even the Class D amplifiers, you know, the older generation Pioneers that use the ICE modules, could not drive a 4-ohm load very well above 3 kilohertz. It would just fall apart. That 200 watt per channel rating would go down to like 50 or 60 watts. So there are limitations, and we need to know what those limitations are. So truth and power is, give us some more disclosure. Give us the full bandwidth rating for 2 and 3 channels driven. I would like to see 4-ohm ratings. You're not going to probably see that, because in order to get UL certification on these products and meet their heat dissipation requirements, they put that damn impedance switch on the thing, which nukes the power in that receiver. It derates the power of the receiver, so it distorts quicker, so that way they can test it at a lower power level and it dissipates less heat. The only way you're going to get around that is to have more heatsink area, you know, bigger, beefier output devices, a bigger power supply, and you're just probably not going to get that unless you get the old 100-pound 10-channel Denon receivers from yesteryear, which you know they're not making anymore. So I think those are relics from the past. I think we're kind of not going to see those kind of super receivers again. I could be wrong, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. So if you do have a speaker system, some of the better speaker systems on the market do tend to be 4 ohms or lower impedance, and you do tend to need an external amplifier to supplement your receiver to take some of the stress off of it. I think we definitely need to have people and educate people to be able to differentiate that and when you need to upgrade your power.
And Matt, if I'm not mistaken, maybe you could comment a little bit about the fact that even though someone who is looking to have an AVR, speakers that are rated for 8 ohms and 6 ohms aren't always at that impedance, right?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So we often refer to a speaker as being like a resistor. We call it 8 ohms, 6 ohms, 4 ohms, but they're not resistors. They're actually more like inductors. They're reactive. So basically what that means is that if you look at the resistance at any one frequency, the speaker's resistance changes. And so what you often see, especially at lower frequencies, is that the speaker's response at low frequencies, I'm sorry, not the response, so the speaker's resistance at lower frequencies is often lower. And that can be difficult for something like a receiver to drive. So if you're trying to run your main speakers full range, for instance, and you're putting a good amount of bass through them, and your speaker actually drops to 4 ohms or 3 ohms, or, you know, there's some out there that drop even below that, that can be really difficult. That requires quite a bit of current. And that's actually, you know, we were talking earlier, Gene, you were getting into this idea that the amplifier power supply tends to be a big limiting factor. And so you've got the transformer, you've got the capacitors, and the rail voltage, of course, is fixed on these. And what that means is that the size of that transformer dictates ultimately how much power it can put out, how much current it can put out to equal that power. And at lower impedances, what starts to happen is that the transformer, for the most part, limits that, and they can't put out a lot of power. So one of the reasons to upgrade to higher end amplifiers is that they tend to have significantly larger transformers. And as a result, that bigger power supply can produce quite a bit more power.
That's a great point, because I might, for example, have an 8 ohm speaker, and then I'm looking at what the output is of an AVR. And then if I'm not really careful, I'm seeing that they're measuring that only at 1 kilohertz, where my speaker at a different frequency might dip down into 6, 4, or down even into 3 ohms. That might give the AVR some trouble, right?
That's right. And one of the reasons Gene talks about the full power bandwidth versus at 1 kilohertz is that also stresses the power supply more. So going back to that idea, receivers by nature, I mean, if you look at the articles that Audioholics has put out over the years, the same problem that started back in the 2-channel days when we went from 2-channel to 5-channel, and then 5-channel to 7-channel, and now we're looking at like 13-channel plus receivers, is that power supply basically had to stay the same size. In fact, it really got smaller, and it got smaller because we were putting more stuff into those receivers, because copper got more expensive, steel got more expensive. They had to keep the cost the same. I mean, if you look way back, essentially the cost of receivers has gone down from what it used to be back in like the 60s. And power ratings have really gone up. And yet that's not, how do you do that? You can't. So what they've really done is lied. And so when we go back to the idea of putting out power at low impedances, that smaller transformer has limited their ability to do that. And that's why they really can't do this. The other problem, of course, is sticking all that stuff into a single receiver chassis and then trying to put a heat sink on it that can actually dissipate power. Again, we used to have 2 channels, then we had 5. I got 13 channels. How are you going to dissipate 13 channels worth of power and not have that thing overheat on you?
Well, guys, I wanted to show you. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. I just thought this was funny. I just came up with this little graphic using the Star Wars and saying, hey, help us, Sound United. You're our only hope. I was really energized when we went to go visit Sound United a few weeks ago, Teo, as you know.
And Gene, why, and maybe this is an open question for the two of you, why is Sound United such an important player in this Audioholics proposal for honest power ratings?
Here's why I think Sound United could save the industry. I think because after the acquisition of Pioneer and Onkyo, assuming that goes through, Sound United as a company is going to have, they're going to have Denon, Marantz, Onkyo, Integra, Pioneer. They're going to have 5 brands of AV receivers. Okay, so what's left at that point? What's left is you got Yamaha, who's a really big player. You've got Sony, who's really more of a home theater in a box TV company. I mean, they've got some receivers, but nobody takes their receivers seriously. Let's be honest. They haven't done anything serious with ES in like 20 years, at least. So you've got, what's left from that is you got some of the esoteric high-end brands like Anthem and NAD, and Arkham. Now, Anthem is pretty honest about how they rate power. They do the 2 channels driven, and then they derate for multi-channel, but mostly because their Atmos channels don't have the same power as their main channels. At least they're honest about that. NAD is given all channels driven all the time on their amplifiers. Kudos to them, because they give you the higher power at 2 channels, and they give you the all channels driven rating. But their receivers, they're smart. They don't put more than 7 channels of amplification in their receivers. They tell you to go buy an external amplifier because they don't want to shrink the power supply and put more amplifiers in the same size chassis. So kudos to NAD for keeping them honest. Then you've got Arkham, who's kind of in the same boat as NAD. They also rate all channels driven. So really what we're worried about is Sound United, Yamaha, and Sony. Okay? My theory is if Sound United gets behind this, and I let them read this article before I published it because I wanted to make sure I had all my I's dotted and my T's crossed. I wanted to make them fully aware of my proposal. And if they can come out and get rid of that goddamn sticker on the front panel of the receivers, excuse my French, for the 1 channel driven rating, and give us at least 2 channels driven and then an abbreviated all channels driven as I propose, and we could educate enough people about that, then Yamaha's going to have no choice but to do the same thing. Otherwise, people are going to call them out and say, hey, you guys are giving us bogus ratings. Now, I don't know about Sony because I have no contact really with Sony, but I can tell you one thing about Sony that really kind of ticks me off. When I went on their website, they don't even give you FTC power on their products. So they're just giving you that 1 channel rating. They're in clear violation of FTC regulation. And in fact, I know the former chair of FTC, he read this article, Dennis Murphy. I'm getting him involved to help me contact the FTC, and we're going to put a formal complaint about this industry, about the consumer industry and how they're inflating power ratings. And we want them to come in and enforce power ratings. So I'm hoping, we also started this movement on, what is it, move.org or whatever?
Right, change.org.
I'm sorry, change.org. We started that. We want to get your signatures. Please don't donate. I didn't realize that they were going to hit people up for money. I don't know where that money goes. There's been a ton of people that have been donating money. We don't get that money. I don't know how they repurpose that money. So please don't donate. Just sign it, because I want to take the number of signatures that are on this thing. I think we've got almost 400 signatures now. And I want to bring it to all the receiver manufacturers and say, look, this movement is growing. People care. They want to know about power ratings. So I think if we keep this up and we keep vigilant about it, we can together, it's not just Audioholics. I'm going to do what I can. We're the only publication left that actually measures amplifier power. Sound and Vision doesn't measure anymore multi-channel receivers. Stereophile is mostly 2-channel. So we're the only domestic publication now that's measuring multi-channel receivers. So it's either us or the FTC or both of us, but that's still not enough. We need to get consumers involved. This needs to be everybody that reads Audioholics, any audiophile that cares about the quality of the product that they're buying and truth in advertising needs to get behind this movement, needs to write your favorite manufacturer saying, hey, I read this article on Audioholics. I want you guys to spec power more honestly, or I'm not buying your product. That's the bottom line.
So, Gene, what we're really asking of our listeners and really the Audioholics audience is we're asking a couple of things. Number one is on the article, you'll find a link to the change.org petition. And it's important that we sign, because we as a consumer have the opportunity right now to have a voice. And what we're really asking for is just honest power ratings so we can make informed decisions. The second thing, and Gene, you mentioned this about if you get a donation link, that donation link doesn't go to Audioholics, but change.org does that with some of their petitions to help boost those petitions if somebody goes to the main website. The third thing is turn to social media. If you're on Twitter, make sure you follow Audioholics Live, and be sure to retweet some of the posts that are coming on that channel about the truth and power, and use the hashtag TI Power. Again, use the hashtag TI Power for your posts. And you know what? Hashtag some of the manufacturers as well, because we'll be able to follow that social conversation. It's also been posted on the Audioholics Facebook page as well. So make it a point to note that you as a consumer, you as someone who's viewing the channel, you have a voice, and that's important. So let me kick over to one of the questions in the forum for a second, because there's, Gene, since you mentioned Anthem and the fact that Anthem does not rate all of their, or really they don't have the same amplifier modules for all of their channels. There's a two-part question, and
their receivers, by the way, let's qualify.
The first part of the question is it important for all the amplifier channels to be the same? That's the question, first one. And the second one from Bent Povey is, do we realistically need more than a 3-channel power amp to supplement an AVR in case you do need more power? So I throw those two questions out.
Okay, this is strictly my opinion. Obviously, the Atmos channels don't deliver as much sound or effect as your main front 3 LCRs, or even all of your bed channels, you know, your surrounds and your surround backs. I do believe that the Atmos channel should be, the power should be at least, you know, within 3 dB of the rest of the amplifier. So if your receiver or your amplifier is rated at 150 watts a channel for the 5 or 7 channels for the bed channels, or for the floor channels, then I think the Atmos channel should be at least half that power. I think if you start getting too low, I think if you're looking at a 50-watt amplifier for the Atmos channels and you have 200 watts or 300 watts for all the other channels, I think that's a little bit of too much of an imbalance, and you start limiting the dynamic range of your system, not only on the power, but now you also have a speaker that's up in the ceiling that, you know, might be too bandwidth limited. It doesn't have the same kind of frequency response as the rest of your channels. I do like to have as much timbre matching as possible. I know it's not always realistic. You can't have obviously full range speakers all around you, but there should be a minimum standard, I think, within a 3 dB limit. And, you know, Matt, you're free to chime in on your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I'll play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. So I agree with what you're saying, but I think one thing to consider too is the needs of the speakers you have in your system to hit a particular output. So In some ways, more important than the actual amplifier power is that you want the dynamic capabilities of all the speakers to be similar, but it's important to understand what the industry kind of came up with as a standard for that. So when we talk about something like reference level, for instance, THX reference level, what we mean is that you want the left, center, and right speaker to each individually be capable of producing around 105 decibels at your listening position. You want all of these surround speakers, not including the Atmos and not including the front speakers, collectively to hit 105 decibels. And you want all of the Atmos speakers to be somewhere, I think they've actually derated it for that, but we'll say 105 decibels. What that means is you actually can get away with less amplifier power for the surrounds, as long as the total number of surround speakers and that amplifier still achieves that level that you want, let's say 105 decibels. And so I think that when you consider not just that it tends to be more bandwidth limited, the surround, but that you typically have more of them. You know, in my theater, I have 4 surround speakers. I think you can get away with less power, and that's okay. The other is that I think most of us, myself and Gene, I know you as well, have significantly larger, more power-hungry front speakers. I mean, mine are very efficient, but they still have giant woofers that will take plenty of power. And I run them full range. I know you do as well. And so those need big amplifiers. My surround speakers have pretty small woofers. They really don't need it.
Yeah, that's a huge point. I mean, I assume 95% of people aren't setting up systems like we are. Because I run subs in my main channels, I have a kilowatt going to each of those speakers, whereas the rest of my system is only 150 watts. So yeah, it really depends. If you're bass managing, then you definitely don't need as much power to all the channels. But the other question someone said is, how many amplifier channels do I need to supplement my receiver? Well, we have an article that kind of gives you a